Hello and welcome. Tonight, settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel much farther back than kingdoms, cities, farms, or even the oldest stories humans ever learned to tell. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the distant past, you can like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Because tonight, we are going to a place where one of the simplest stories about ourselves began to fall apart. For a long time, the origin of our species was easy to picture on a map. You could point toward Eastern Africa. Imagine a relatively small ancestral population living there roughly 200,000 years ago and say, somewhere around here, Homo sapiens appeared. Then, much later, those humans spread outward. It was neat, understandable, almost comforting. There was just one problem. In Morocco, thousands of kilometers away from the places most closely associated with that old picture, people had been lying beneath the ground for roughly 300,000 years. And when scientists finally understood how old they were, their faces looked disturbingly familiar. The place is called Jebel Irhoud, a limestone ridge west of Marrakesh. Today it is famous among researchers studying human origins, but its importance was not obvious when human remains first began appearing there around 1960. Nobody had arrived with a grand plan to discover the beginning of humanity. People were mining barite. The distinction matters because archaeology usually depends on context. The exact depth of an object, the sediment surrounding it, the relationship between a bone and a stone tool a few centimeters away, all of these details can contain information. A mine is interested in something else entirely. It removes rock because the rock is in the way. And so there is a peculiar irony at the beginning of the Jebel Irhoud story. The activity that revealed one of the most important prehistoric sites in Africa was also capable of destroying the very evidence that researchers would later desperately want to reconstruct. During the mining operations, a human skull emerged. It became known as Irhoud I. Another cranium, Irhoud II, was discovered soon afterward, and over time more fragments appeared. Pieces of jaws, teeth, cranial remains, and bones, representing both adults and younger individuals. They were clearly ancient. But exactly how ancient was another question. Early interpretations placed the site in a much more recent period than researchers would eventually accept. The stone tools complicated matters as well. Some were compared with technologies associated with Neanderthals in Europe, and the human remains themselves passed through interpretations that made sense within the evolutionary frameworks available at the time. This is one of the quieter difficulties of studying human origins. Fossils do not arrive with names attached. A fragment of skull does not announce its species. A stone flake does not tell you who made it. A tooth does not explain whether its owner belongs near the beginning of your lineage, somewhere beside it, or on a branch that eventually disappeared. Scientists have to reconstruct those relationships from anatomy, geology, archaeology, dating methods, and comparison with other discoveries. And sometimes, decades later, the evidence rearranges the entire picture. By the early 21st century, new excavations at Jebel Irhoud were being conducted with far greater control than had been possible during the site's early mining history. Researchers recovered additional human fossils from deposits containing animal bones and Middle Stone Age tools. Crucially, some of the flint artifacts had been heated. That apparently ordinary detail would become enormously important. Long before anyone understood radiation, crystal lattices, or geological dating, somebody at Jebel Irhoud had brought stone close enough to fire for heat to reset a physical signal inside it. Afterward, while the stone remained buried, energy produced by natural environmental radiation gradually accumulated again. Hundreds of thousands of years later, researchers could measure that signal. The fire had accidentally started a clock. The resulting thermoluminescence estimate was approximately 315,000 years, with an uncertainty of about 34,000 years on either side. An independent dating approach involving a human tooth produced another estimate broadly compatible with this unexpectedly deep age. Suddenly, Jebel Irhoud was no longer merely an interesting prehistoric Moroccan site. It was sitting roughly 100,000 years deeper in time than the simple version of Homo sapiens' origins many people had grown accustomed to hearing. But age alone was not the strangest part. The skulls themselves were. When researchers examined the Jebel Irhoud faces, several features fell surprisingly close to the conditions seen in later Homo sapiens. These were not simply the enormous projecting faces that popular images of archaic humans encourage us to expect. Viewed from the front, there was something recognizably human about them, but move around the skull and the impression changed. The brain case was more elongated than the rounded, globular, cranial vault typical of humans living today. The face seemed to have moved farther toward the anatomy of our species than the skull behind it. This is sometimes described as mosaic evolution, different parts of the anatomy changing at different rates, rather than the entire human body crossing some invisible boundary at once. And that creates a problem much larger than Jebel Irhoud. Suppose there had never been a single generation in which an archaic population suddenly produced a finished version of Homo sapiens. Suppose the face changed first. Other features changed later. Different populations carried different combinations of old and new anatomy. Some became isolated for long periods. Later, they encountered one another again. Genes moved between them. Behaviors and technologies moved too, although not necessarily in the same way or at the same speed. In that kind of world, asking for the exact birthplace of our species may be a little like asking where a river begins, when dozens of streams repeatedly divide and join before reaching the sea. The people represented at Jebel Irhoud were not living in a modern Moroccan desert landscape transplanted unchanged into the distant past. North Africa repeatedly changed as climate shifted. Landscapes expanded and contracted. Water and vegetation moved. Animal populations followed them, and humans had to do the same. The bones at the site preserve some of those relationships. Gazelles were especially important among the animals processed by the people there. Researchers have found cut marks on animal remains and evidence of bones being broken, including the kind of damage associated with obtaining marrow. It is a small detail, but it brings the site briefly out of the abstract world of skull measurements. A gazelle carcass does not process itself. Someone had to cut through hide and connective tissue with stone. Someone had to separate useful portions, decide what was worth carrying, break open bones for the fat-rich marrow inside, and do all of this in a landscape shared with carnivores, including hyenas and leopards. There was no refrigerated store of food waiting for a bad hunting day. There was no electric light when the sun disappeared. There was no manufactured blade that could simply be replaced when its edge failed. The stone itself had to be selected and worked, and the prepared core techniques found at Jebel Irhoud required something more sophisticated than randomly striking rocks together. A successful napper had to prepare the geometry of the core in advance so that later blows produced useful flakes. That knowledge had to live somewhere. There were no written instructions. It lived in people. Someone learned where useful stone could be found. Someone learned how hard to strike it. Younger people had to watch, practice, and remember. If knowledge moved between generations, it did so because human beings carried it. The same was true of the landscape. Water had to be remembered. Animal movements had to be learned. A safe route could matter. So could a dangerous one. And when night arrived, the geography of the world contracted toward whatever light a fire could provide. We should be careful here. Archaeology cannot tell us what a particular person at Jebel Irhoud feared while sitting in the darkness. It cannot recover a private thought from 300,000 years ago, but it can show us the environment in which those thoughts occurred. There were humans. There were prey animals. There were large carnivores. There was fire. There were children as well as adults. And there was a landscape in which obtaining food, maintaining tools, finding water, and remaining mobile were ordinary requirements of survival. These people were therefore not important only because their skulls eventually became museum specimens. They had already solved the practical problem of being human every day of their lives. And yet, calling them simply people like us would go too far in the other direction. Their anatomy is valuable precisely because it refuses to fit comfortably into either category. They are familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. That ambiguity is what made the dating of Jebel Irhoud so disruptive. If people with remarkably sapiens-like facial anatomy were already living in northwestern Africa around 300,000 years ago, then the older image of our species, emerging relatively recently from one small Eastern African homeland, becomes much harder to maintain. But replacing Ethiopia with Morocco would solve nothing. Jebel Irhoud does not tell us that Morocco was the true Garden of Eden and everyone else descended from people who walked out of it. It suggests something considerably stranger. At approximately the same enormous stretch of prehistory, different populations were living across different parts of Africa, and the fossils they left behind do not all look alike. Some later fossils would look, in certain respects, more modern than the older people from Morocco. Others would preserve their own mixtures of archaic and derived anatomy. And much farther south, another kind of human entirely was still alive during part of this period. So the real question was beginning to change. Scientists had spent generations searching for where Homo sapiens began. Jebel Irhoud raised the possibility that the answer might not be a place at all. To understand why, we have to leave Morocco for a while and cross the continent toward Ethiopia, where another ancient human skull had been quietly complicating the same story from the opposite direction. More than 4,000 kilometers east of Jebel Irhoud, in the lower valley of Ethiopia's Omo River, another collection of human remains had been waiting inside a very different landscape. If Jebel Irhoud complicated the question of where Homo sapiens began, Omo complicated something even more basic: what an early Homo sapiens was supposed to look like. The Omo Valley is one of those places where geology has been unusually generous to paleoanthropologists. Sediments accumulated over immense spans of time, volcanic eruptions occasionally scattered ash across the region, and erosion later exposed layers containing traces of ancient animals and humans. Each process damaged some evidence while preserving other parts of it, leaving researchers with a broken but unusually deep record. In 1967, an expedition working in the Kibish Formation recovered human fossils that became known as Omo 1 and Omo 2. They were ancient, but they were not identical, and that difference would eventually become almost as important as their age. Omo I possesses a combination of features that paleoanthropologists recognize as strongly characteristic of Homo sapiens. The cranial vault is high, the face is comparatively modern. Most strikingly, the lower jaw includes a true chin, one of the anatomical features closely associated with our species. If you reconstructed Omo I beside the people from Jebel Irhoud, the chronological order might not be obvious from appearance alone. Jebel Irhoud is older, at roughly 315,000 years, according to the central thermoluminescence estimate. Omo Y is younger, and yet Omo 1 looks, in important anatomical respects, more like people living today. That alone should make us suspicious of any evolutionary illustration in which one skull gradually transforms into another, as though someone were adjusting a slider from primitive to modern. Evolution does not promise to arrange its fossils for our convenience. For years, Omo 1 was commonly dated to around 195,000 years ago. That already made it one of the oldest, widely accepted examples of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Then volcanic ash changed the chronology. The Kibish Formation contains layers of volcanic material produced by enormous eruptions in the East African Rift. These eruptions are useful because volcanic ash can sometimes be chemically matched to its source and dated with techniques unavailable when the fossils were originally discovered. Researchers eventually linked a thick volcanic ash layer lying above the Omo 1 deposits to an eruption of Ethiopia's Shala volcano. The eruption was dated to approximately 233,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of about 22,000 years. Because Omo I lies beneath that volcanic layer, the fossil must be older than the eruption. So the revised result does not give Omo 1 a simple birthday of 233,000 years. It gives us a minimum age. Omo I was already there before the ash arrived. This is an important distinction because deep prehistory rarely provides the sort of dates we use for kings, battles, or written documents. There is usually no single year waiting to be discovered. Instead, researchers build chronological boundaries from sediments, volcanic deposits, radioactive decay, and physical processes that occurred before or after the event they are trying to understand. For someone living beside the ancient Omo River, of course, none of this chronology existed. A volcanic eruption was not a future dating marker. Ash was simply ash. A river was not an archaeological formation. It was water, movement, animals, mud, vegetation, and opportunity. And somewhere in that landscape lived humans whose skeletons were beginning to resemble ours with remarkable clarity. But Omo I was not alone. The second famous cranium, Omo 2, presents a more archaic appearance. Its cranial vault is lower and more robust, and its anatomy has long made its exact position in human evolution more difficult to discuss neatly. Although the geological relationship between the discoveries has required careful interpretation, both belong to the same broad world of late Middle Pleistocene humans in the Omo region. And that creates a wonderfully inconvenient problem. If early Homo sapiens were supposed to represent a clean anatomical stage, why did ancient African humans show so much variation? The easiest explanation would be to imagine a straight line. Jebel Irhoud comes first. Then something more modern appears. Then something still more modern. Eventually, us. But fossils refuse to line up that way. Different anatomical traits appear in different combinations. A younger specimen may preserve an archaic characteristic. An older specimen may possess a surprisingly derived one. Two populations separated geographically may share features, while humans living within the same broad period may look noticeably different. The farther researchers push into this period, the less useful the old evolutionary ladder becomes. A ladder has one direction. Africa did not. Around the time represented by Jebel Irhoud and the early Omo fossils, the continent contained an enormous range of environments. Tropical forests occupied some regions, grasslands stretched across others. Rift valleys, highlands, lakes, river systems, deserts and coastlines created different ecological worlds. And none of these environments remained permanently stable. That instability matters. A human population does not experience climate change as a graph. It experiences the consequences. A familiar water source becomes unreliable. Animals begin appearing at different times or move elsewhere. Vegetation changes. A route used by previous generations becomes harder to cross. Another route opens. Families move. Groups become separated. People who once encountered one another may stop meeting for generations. Then conditions change again. This is where the idea of a single African birthplace begins to encounter a geographical problem. If populations repeatedly became separated and later reconnected, evolution could occur in several places at once. One group might spend thousands of years largely isolated in Eastern Africa. Another could live far to the north. Others occupied southern regions. During periods of separation, genetic differences could accumulate. Anatomical characteristics could become more common in one population than another. Technologies could change locally. Then, a wetter climatic interval might reconnect landscapes. People move. Neighbors meet neighbors. Over many generations, genes can travel through chains of populations far beyond the distance any individual person ever walked. No ancient traveller needed to cross the entire African continent for Africa to function as an interconnected evolutionary system. This point is easy to miss because maps encourage us to think in straight arrows. An arrow begins in one place and ends somewhere else. Real human movement is usually less elegant. A group follows animals toward water. A young person joins another group. A drought pushes people away from a familiar region. A lake expands and makes one route difficult while creating resources somewhere else. Generations later, descendants occupy territory their ancestors may never have seen. The result, accumulated across tens of thousands of years, can move genes across astonishing distances without anything resembling a planned migration. And those distances were not empty. Every movement occurred through landscapes already occupied by animals, competitors, predators, and sometimes other humans. For a small, mobile population, geography was not an abstract background. It determined the cost of almost everything. Water has weight. So does stone. So does meat. Children cannot move at an adult pace indefinitely. An injured person changes how quickly everyone else can travel. A carcass large enough to feed several people is also large enough to become inconvenient very quickly. These are small physical constraints, but repeated across generations they shape where humans can live and how far social connections can extend. This is one reason rivers and lakes mattered so much. Water attracts animals. Animals attract predators. Humans also need water. The same productive location can therefore be useful and dangerous at once. The ancient Omo region offered rich ecological opportunities, but nobody living there possessed exclusive rights to them. Other carnivores occupied the landscape. Seasonality altered resources. Flooding could reshape river margins. The comfortable modern distinction between a human place and a wild place did not exist. Humans were part of the ecology they were trying to understand, and understanding it was itself a survival technology. Knowing when animals appeared could matter as much as possessing a sharp stone edge. Knowing where water remained during a dry period could matter more. Knowing which routes connected one productive area to another could become information carried across generations. None of this requires us to imagine that early Homo sapiens possessed detailed maps or consciously understood continental climate systems. Their knowledge could be intensely local. But local knowledge repeated through thousands of generations produces something much larger. This becomes especially important when we return to the physical differences between fossils. If Africa contained populations that were sometimes connected and sometimes isolated, there is no reason to expect every early Homo sapiens population to look exactly alike. Variation becomes normal. The unusual thing would be perfect uniformity. And this changes the meaning of Omo 1. Omo I does not need to represent a finished species that suddenly appeared after Jebel Irhoud. It may instead preserve one combination of traits within a broader, changing population network. The face and cranial anatomy of Jebel Irhoud preserve another combination. Later fossils will show others. The temptation is always to ask, which one is the real ancestor? But ancestry rarely works so neatly over hundreds of thousands of years. Consider what happens even within ordinary human families. A person inherits different pieces of ancestry through different lines. Go back enough generations, and the number of genealogical relationships expands rapidly, with lines repeatedly overlapping. Now enlarge that process from families to populations, and extend it across hundreds of millennia. Some populations disappear entirely. Some survive genetically through neighbouring groups. Others may contribute only a small portion of ancestry to much later humans. A population can cease to exist as a recognizable group without every part of its genetic legacy vanishing. This is one reason a fossil cannot automatically be treated as either our ancestor or not our ancestor. A skull is an individual. Evolution happens through populations, and populations have histories far more complicated than the bones of one person can reveal. There is another difficulty. Most of those people left no bones for us at all. Fossilization is extraordinarily selective. After death, a body normally begins a long process of disappearance. Soft tissue decomposes. Scavengers can disturb remains. Bones may be scattered, weathered, broken, or dissolved. Sediments may never cover them under conditions favourable for preservation. Even if a bone survives, geological processes can destroy the deposit later. Even if the deposit survives, nobody may find it. And even if somebody finds it, the surrounding context must survive well enough for the specimen to be dated and interpreted. So, when we place Jebel Irhoud and Omo on a map, the empty territory between them should not be mistaken for an empty human landscape. It is mostly an empty evidence landscape. That distinction becomes increasingly important as we move west, south, and north across prehistoric Africa. Entire populations may have lived for thousands of generations without leaving a single fossil we have yet discovered. Central Africa is particularly difficult because warm, wet environments are generally hostile to long-term preservation of both bone and ancient DNA. Other regions have simply received less archaeological investigation. Ancient coastlines have shifted as sea levels rose and fell, placing some former landscapes underwater. The map we possess is therefore distorted before interpretation even begins. It reflects where fossils survived, where geology exposed them, where researchers looked, where excavation was possible, and sometimes, as at Jebel Irhoud, where a mine happened to cut into the right hill. That makes the desire to identify one birthplace from a handful of dots increasingly dangerous. Still, the temptation remained powerful, especially because Eastern Africa continued producing extraordinary fossils. About 70,000 years or more after the minimum age now established for Omo I, another population lived in what is today Ethiopia's Afar region. Their remains were discovered at Herto. These humans were unmistakably close to us, yet once again they carried combinations of features that prevented the story from becoming perfectly tidy. The Herto skulls were large and robust. When formally described, researchers gave them the subspecies name Homo sapiens idaltu, emphasizing their place close to modern humans while acknowledging anatomical differences. Whether that subspecies designation is especially useful today is less important for our purposes than what the fossils reveal. By roughly 160,000 years ago, humans with strongly Homo sapiens anatomy were clearly present in Eastern Africa. But they were not simply miniature copies of people alive now, nor had all the anatomical diversity visible earlier across Africa disappeared. The human form was still changing. This means that between Jebel Irhoud, Omo and Herto, we do not have three convenient frames from a transformation sequence. We have samples from different populations, different landscapes, and different moments in a much larger process. And there is something almost absurd about how little material we are asking to carry such an enormous story. Hundreds of thousands of years of human existence, countless births, deaths, movements, droughts, encounters, separations, children learning from adults, groups disappearing, other groups expanding, and from all of it we recover a skull here, a jaw there, several teeth somewhere else. Then we try to reconstruct a continent. This is why each new fossil can produce such disproportionate disruption. The sample is tiny enough that one discovery can change the apparent geography of an entire species. Before Jebel Irhoud was correctly dated, northwestern Africa looked less important to the earliest phase of Homo sapiens evolution. Afterward, it became impossible to ignore. The same could happen again. An older fossil may still be underground somewhere else. Perhaps it will be found in a region already famous for early humans. Perhaps not. Its existence would not make Jebel Irhoud unimportant. It would simply remind us that oldest known describes our evidence, not the first person who ever possessed a particular anatomical trait. And by now, another problem is becoming visible. If we cannot identify the beginning of Homo sapiens merely by lining fossils up from oldest to youngest, perhaps anatomy alone will not solve the question. We need another kind of evidence. Fortunately, every living human carries one. Inside our cells are records of ancestry that bones cannot provide. Genetics once seemed capable of giving human origins the clean answer the fossils refused to offer. Instead, when researchers looked closely enough, our DNA began telling an even stranger story. For a while, genetics seemed to offer exactly what the fossils could not. Bones were scattered, incomplete, and frustratingly rare. DNA, by contrast, exists inside every living person. If researchers could compare enough genomes and work backward through the differences between them, perhaps the tangled collection of skulls from Jebel Irhoud, Omo and Herto could finally be replaced by something cleaner, a family tree written inside us. And genetics did establish something profound. The deepest genetic diversity among living humans is found in Africa. Our species has a much longer population history there than anywhere else, and the ancestors of people living outside Africa represent only part of that much older African diversity. But the closer researchers looked at what happened within Africa, the less the picture resembled a single population waiting in one place to become everyone else. One of the best-known examples of how genetic evidence can be simplified beyond recognition is the woman popularly called mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondria are tiny structures inside our cells that possess their own DNA. In ordinary human inheritance, mitochondrial DNA passes primarily from mother to child. A daughter can pass it onward. A son generally does not. If researchers compare mitochondrial DNA among living people and trace those maternal lineages backward, they eventually converge on a woman from whom the mitochondrial DNA of everyone alive today descends. This sounds much more dramatic than it actually is. She was not the first woman. She was not the first Homo sapiens woman. She was not necessarily the only common female ancestor of living humans at the time. And she certainly was not living alone while waiting for someone to invent the rest of humanity. There were other women around her. They had children. Many of those women can still be genealogical ancestors of people alive today through other branches of inheritance. Their mitochondrial lines simply ended somewhere along the way. Perhaps, many generations later, one lineage produced only sons. Perhaps another family left no surviving descendants. The mitochondrial lineage disappears, while other portions of that person's ancestry may continue through the population. The distinction sounds technical, but it matters because the phrase mitochondrial Eve encourages exactly the kind of origin story the evidence does not support. One mother, one population, one beginning. Genetics is much messier than that. Each section of our genome can have its own history. Move far enough backward and different pieces of DNA trace through different ancestors. Some lineages merge sooner, others remain separate for much longer. Recombination reshuffles genetic material every generation, so the ancestry inside one person is already a patchwork long before we attempt to trace it across hundreds of thousands of years. At the scale of populations, the problem becomes even more interesting. Suppose two ancient populations live far apart. For several thousand years, contact between them is rare. Genetic differences begin to accumulate. Then conditions change. The range of an animal expands. A formerly dry region becomes easier to cross. A river system provides a new route. Neighbouring populations begin interacting more often. Only a small number of people need to move between communities for genes to cross the boundary. The populations do not need to merge completely. They do not need to become identical. They only need to remain connected, often enough that ancestry continues passing between them. Then, climate changes again. Contact declines. The process repeats. Over a few generations, this may look insignificant. Over 200,000 years, it can become the structure of a species. This is one reason recent genetic models of African human origins have become so important. Rather than beginning with one ancestral Homo sapiens population that splits neatly into separate branches, researchers have tested models in which multiple ancestral populations remained weakly differentiated while exchanging genes over very long periods. One influential genomic study published in 2023 found that the genetic variation among contemporary African populations could be explained well by a model involving at least two ancestral Homo populations that had remained connected by gene flow for hundreds of thousands of years. The researchers described this in terms of a weakly structured stem. The phrase is not especially romantic, but the idea behind it is extraordinary. A stem normally sounds singular. Here, the ancestral structure behaves more like several connected populations. They are different enough for population structure to exist, but not necessarily separated enough to become entirely independent evolutionary worlds. And if that broad model is close to reality, then the question, which population became Homo sapiens, becomes increasingly difficult to answer. There may not have been one. This does not mean every human group in Africa was constantly mixing with every other group. Africa is far too large for that, and its environments were far too variable. Nor does it mean Jebel Irhoud has been genetically demonstrated to be part of the direct ancestry of everyone alive today. We do not have DNA from the Jebel Irhoud individuals. That absence is itself important. Ancient DNA survives poorly in many warm environments. After death, DNA molecules begin breaking down, and heat accelerates the process. Over immense spans of time, the fragments become shorter and more chemically damaged until recovering useful genetic information becomes extraordinarily difficult. Cold environments are much kinder. This creates a rather unfair archaeological situation. Some populations that lived much later in cold parts of Eurasia have provided researchers with astonishingly detailed genomes. Meanwhile, populations living close to the deepest history of Homo sapiens in Africa may have left us skulls, teeth, and stone tools, but no readable DNA at all. We therefore know more genetically about some Neanderthals who lived tens of thousands of years ago than we do about people who may have stood close to the early emergence of our own species hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The archive is biased by temperature, and that means fossils and genetics are often forced to answer different questions. A fossil can show what one individual looked like. Teeth can preserve information about development and diet. Stone tools can reveal something about learned behavior and technical choices. Animal remains can show which species people processed. Sediments can preserve clues about environment. Genetics can reveal relationships among populations and patterns of ancestry. But none of these sources provides the whole person. More importantly, they do not always point toward the same geographical answer. A population can be archaeologically visible and leave little genetic contribution to later people. Another population can disappear almost completely from the fossil record while contributing significantly to descendants. This is easy to underestimate. The number of fossils we find has nothing to do with how many descendants a population deserves to have. Fossilization does not reward evolutionary success. It rewards geological luck. A group living beside a lake where sediment rapidly covers remains may leave fossils. Another population several hundred kilometers away may live on acidic soil where bone disappears. If the second population contributes more ancestry to later humans, the fossil record can still make the first population look more important. The map of discoveries is therefore not the same thing as the map of ancestry. And once that distinction is understood, the empty spaces across Africa begin to look very different. Central Africa, much of Western Africa, and enormous portions of the Sahara remain poorly represented in the deep human fossil record compared with a few exceptionally productive regions. Those blank areas on a museum map can create an illusion. We see fossils clustered in Morocco, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa, and unconsciously imagine human populations clustered there as well. But people did not know where future paleoanthropologists would establish excavation projects. They lived wherever conditions allowed them to live. Some of the most important ancestral populations may have occupied landscapes that preserve almost nothing. Others may remain beneath sediments that nobody has excavated. And some ancient landscapes are no longer on land at all. During the Pleistocene, sea levels rose and fell repeatedly as enormous quantities of water became locked in continental ice and later returned to the oceans. Coastlines shifted. Places that were once usable terrestrial habitats were eventually submerged. If ancient humans spent significant time along productive coastal environments, part of that record may now lie beneath the sea. So there are at least 3 different maps. There is the map of where ancient humans actually lived. There is the much smaller map of where their remains survived. And there is the smaller map again of what we have managed to discover. We usually see only the third. Then we try to reconstruct the first. Genetics can help fill some of that darkness. But even genetic reconstruction has limits. Researchers are working backward from people alive today, or from the relatively small number of ancient genomes that survive. Populations that contributed no ancestry to living humans can become genetically invisible unless ancient DNA from them happens to survive. An entire human population could have lived for tens of thousands of years, interacted with neighbouring groups, and eventually disappeared. If it left no recoverable DNA, and no recognized fossils, we would know nothing about it. Yet it could still have mattered while it existed. It could have transmitted technologies. Its members could have moved into neighbouring populations. Small amounts of its ancestry might survive in ways difficult to identify. And this leads to another strange possibility that geneticists have had to consider. Some patterns in African genomes have been interpreted as possible evidence of deeply diverged or ghost populations. Ancestral groups known not from a skull or a skeleton, but from unusual genetic signals in later humans. Exactly how these signals should be interpreted remains debated. Deep population structure can sometimes resemble admixture from a separate archaic population, and researchers do not agree on every model. But the debate itself is revealing. We have reached a point where some of the humans potentially involved in our ancestry may be visible only as mathematical disturbances inside the genomes of people living much later. No cave, no skull, no reconstructed face, just ancestry that does not fit comfortably into a simpler model. This is where the traditional family tree becomes particularly misleading. A tree branches. Once 2 branches divide, they remain separate. But human populations can separate and meet again. A better image is a river crossing a broad, uneven plain. One channel divides around an island, another joins it from somewhere else. A branch narrows, disappears, or reconnects downstream. During a dry period, connections weaken. During wetter conditions, new channels open. Far downstream, Asking which single upstream channel produced the river becomes increasingly artificial. The water came through several. This is roughly the problem facing researchers who attempt to identify the birthplace of Homo sapiens. If populations in northern, eastern, southern, and perhaps other parts of Africa spent long periods partly isolated but occasionally exchanging genes, then characteristics associated with our species did not have to arise together. A facial configuration might become common in one population. Other cranial changes might develop elsewhere or at another time. Different developmental patterns could spread through connected groups. Behavioral innovations could move faster than genes. And when populations encountered one another, evolution could recombine what separation had allowed to diverge. This does not mean Africa functioned as one enormous mating population. Quite the opposite. The important condition is intermediate. Not complete isolation. Not complete mixing. Enough separation for differences to emerge. Enough contact for those differences to remain part of a larger evolutionary network. That middle ground is difficult to represent in a simple documentary graphic because audiences are accustomed to arrows and branches. But it may be much closer to the world in which our species emerged. And climate may have been one of the mechanisms continually changing the strength of those connections. The Sahara is a perfect example. Today, its scale makes it feel permanent. On a modern map, it forms an enormous dry zone separating Mediterranean North Africa from much of the continent farther south. It is easy to project that barrier backward indefinitely, but the Sahara has repeatedly changed. During humid periods, rainfall increased across regions that are now extraordinarily dry. Lakes expanded. Rivers and wetlands appeared. Grasslands moved northward. Animals entered territories that later became desert again. A landscape that blocks movement during one period can become a corridor during another. Then the window closes. Water retreats. Vegetation contracts. Populations on opposite sides become more isolated. For early humans, these changes were not geological curiosities. They determined which neighbours existed. A person does not experience a humid climatic phase. They experience water where their parents remembered dryness. They experience animals appearing along routes where those animals had previously been scarce. They experience a journey becoming possible. Generations later, descendants may experience the opposite. A lake shrinks. A grassland deteriorates. The distance between reliable water sources becomes too great. The route disappears from ordinary life. Isolation returns. Repeat this across Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, and population structure becomes dynamic rather than permanent. The same group does not need to remain in the same place. The same barrier does not need to remain a barrier. And the same populations do not need to remain equally connected. This helps explain why fossils, separated by enormous distances, can belong to the same broad evolutionary process without requiring a single dramatic migration between them. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Omo in Ethiopia do not have to represent competing claims for the birthplace of humanity. They may represent surviving fragments of a much larger African process. And somewhere in that process, our species emerged, not necessarily through one population defeating or replacing all the others, not necessarily through one anatomical transformation, possibly through prolonged interaction among populations whose differences were never quite large enough to make them entirely separate. But genetics introduces one more uncomfortable lesson. Even if we could reconstruct those ancient populations perfectly, we might still struggle to identify the moment when Homo sapiens began, because the word species asks us to draw a boundary. Evolution does not. And nowhere is that problem clearer than in the strange collection of human faces scattered across Africa around 300,000 years ago. If genetics makes the birthplace of Homo sapiens difficult to locate, the fossils create a different problem. They make it difficult to decide exactly who should be invited into the species. From the perspective of someone alive today, the distinction seems obvious. We know what a modern human looks like. We can compare our skeletons with those of Neanderthals, Homo erectus, or other extinct members of the human family and identify differences. But evolution never had to respect the categories we created afterward. There was no generation in which every parent belonged neatly to one anatomical type, while every child suddenly belonged to another. Traits changed across populations and across enormous spans of time, and they did not all change together. Jebel Irhoud makes this particularly visible. Its faces possess several features that bring them surprisingly close to Homo sapiens, while the brain cases remain more elongated than the globular form typical of people today. If we had found only the faces, our impression might have been more modern. If only the back of the skull had survived, perhaps less so. The classification depends partly on which pieces geology happened to preserve. That should make us cautious whenever a single fragment is asked to carry an enormous evolutionary argument. And Africa has several such fragments. Far south of Morocco, in South Africa's Free State, a spring at Florisbad produced another unusual human skull. The Florisbad cranium is incomplete. Enough survives, however, to reveal another mixture of features that refuses to sit comfortably at one end of a simple archaic to modern sequence. For decades, it has occupied an uncertain place in discussions of human evolution. It has been described in different ways, sometimes connected closely with early Homo sapiens, and sometimes treated as part of a broader group of Middle Pleistocene African humans whose exact relationships remain difficult to resolve. The familiar age, often attached to Florisbad, is around 259,000 years. But even that apparently precise number has become less secure than it once seemed. The age came from a tooth recovered from the site. Later reassessment raised doubts about whether that tooth could confidently be associated with the same deposits as the human cranium. This may sound like an irritating technical problem, but it exposes something important about paleoanthropology. A date is only as useful as the relationship between the dated material and the fossil we care about. If a tooth is 259,000 years old, then the tooth is 259,000 years old. That does not automatically make every object from the surrounding site the same age. Context is what connects them. Lose the context, and certainty begins to loosen. The same principle haunted the early history of Jebel Irhoud, where mining had disturbed parts of the site long before modern excavations could document them carefully. Again and again, the human origin story depends not only on what survives, but on whether researchers can determine exactly where it came from. Still, Florisbad matters even with chronological caution, because its anatomy contributes to the broader pattern. Middle Pleistocene Africa contained humans who combined characteristics in different ways. They were not marching toward us in a tidy anatomical formation. Other fossils from Eastern Africa add still more variation. Specimens from places such as Ngalaba in Tanzania, Elie Springs in Kenya, and other Middle Pleistocene localities have been compared in different ways with both archaic humans and Homo sapiens. Some are fragmentary. Some are difficult to date precisely. Some have inspired decades of disagreement over names. That disagreement is not a sign that paleoanthropologists have failed to notice an obvious answer. The fossils themselves are often genuinely ambiguous. Consider what we are asking researchers to do. Take a partial skull from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Compare it with other incomplete skulls separated by thousands of kilometers and perhaps tens of thousands of years. Determine which differences represent sex, individual variation, age, local population history, evolutionary change, or membership in a different species. Then give the fossil a name. Sometimes the most responsible answer is not particularly satisfying. We do not know. And the difficulty becomes even clearer when we look at what else was living in Africa during approximately the same broad period. In South Africa, deep inside the Rising Star cave system, researchers discovered remains belonging to a human species called Homo naledi. Naledi is immediately strange because its anatomy combines characteristics that, at first glance, seem as though they should belong to very different moments in human evolution. Its brain was much smaller than ours. Parts of the skull, shoulders, and trunk retain relatively primitive characteristics, yet other aspects of the body show their own surprising combinations of traits. When the fossils were first announced, their anatomy made it tempting to assume that they must be extremely ancient. Then they were dated. The results placed the Homo naledi remains in a broad range of approximately 335,000 to 236,000 years ago. In other words, during at least part of the same enormous window in which early Homo sapiens-like populations existed elsewhere in Africa, a very different kind of human was living in the south. This is worth lingering over, because popular accounts of evolution often train us to expect replacement. One type appears, then it changes into another, then that one disappears. Eventually Homo sapiens arrives. But around 300,000 years ago, Africa was not waiting for us to become human. It was already populated by different human lineages. Some may have been closely related to the populations that eventually contributed to living humans. Others followed different evolutionary paths. Their bodies could differ dramatically. Their histories could overlap. And for some period of time, they shared the same continent. Whether any particular early Homo sapiens population ever encountered Homo naledi is unknown. Africa is enormous, and chronological overlap does not prove contact. There is no reason to invent a meeting. But the possibility that radically different human forms could exist simultaneously changes the atmosphere of the period. The world did not contain one unfinished version of humanity. It contained diversity. That diversity would not have been visible to the people living at Jebel Irhoud as a scientific classification. They did not know they belonged to Homo sapiens. Homo naledi did not know it belonged to Homo naledi. Species names arrived hundreds of thousands of years later. The individuals themselves dealt with more immediate distinctions. Familiar people, unfamiliar people, known territory, unknown territory, food, water, children, danger, perhaps neighbouring groups who behaved differently or looked slightly different. How much anatomical difference early humans themselves noticed and what social meaning they attached to it cannot be recovered from these fossils. But biological variation existed whether anyone had words for it or not. And that brings us back to the uncomfortable question of where Homo sapiens begins. If we compare a recent human with a much older hominin, such as Homo erectus, the differences are substantial. But place a series of Middle Pleistocene African fossils between them, and the boundary becomes harder to draw. Faces change, teeth change, jaws change, the cranial vault changes, brain shape changes, developmental patterns change. None of those transformations has to occur in the same population at exactly the same moment. This is why researchers sometimes use terms such as early Homo sapiens, while other fossils have historically been placed under labels like archaic Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, or Homo rhodesiensis. The terminology itself has been debated because the biological reality does not provide convenient boxes. A fossil does not care which label we choose. The label is a tool for us. Useful tools can still have rough edges. The problem becomes almost philosophical if we push it far enough. Suppose we could somehow recover every generation between an unmistakably archaic African population and people whose anatomy falls completely within the range of humans alive today. no missing fossils, no gaps. Parents beside children, generation after generation, stretching across tens of thousands of years. Where would we draw the line? At one particular skull shape, at the appearance of a chin, at a particular arrangement of the face, at the point when the brain case becomes sufficiently globular? And what would we do if those characteristics appeared at different times in different regions? The idea of a first Homo sapiens individual begins to dissolve. Species are real biological populations, but the boundaries we apply to long evolutionary transitions can become fuzzy because descent is continuous. Parents and children remain extremely similar. Yet after enough generations, populations can become strikingly different from distant ancestors. There is no requirement for one dramatic intermediate generation. This is similar to watching a landscape change while walking across it. At one end, there may be forest. Far away, there may be open grassland. Between them is a long transition where trees gradually become less dense. If someone demands the exact meter where the forest ends and grassland begins, you can choose a boundary. But nature did not paint a line there for you. The emergence of Homo sapiens may contain the same kind of problem. Jebel Irhoud becomes especially valuable in this context because it is not simply old. It occupies an awkward place in the transition. Its people are close enough to us in facial anatomy to belong near the early Homo sapiens story, yet different enough in cranial form to show that the story was not finished. Omo 1, later in time, possesses a more derived combination. Herto later still remains robust in ways that distinguish it from the average person alive today. Elsewhere, other African fossils preserve their own mixtures. The pattern looks less like a model being perfected and more like populations experimenting unintentionally through evolution. Of course, evolution has no goal. The people at Jebel Irhoud were not incomplete versions of us. This is an important correction. They were complete versions of themselves. Their bodies had to work in their own environments. Their faces were not waiting to become ours. Their skulls were not mistakes awaiting correction. Natural selection does not know what will exist 300,000 years later. Calling a feature primitive or derived describes its evolutionary relationship, not its quality. A primitive anatomical trait is not a defective one. It is simply closer to an ancestral condition. And in practical life, the distinctions paleoanthropologists use to classify skulls may have mattered far less than skills that leave almost no direct trace in bone. A person who knew where water remained during a dry season could be invaluable. Someone who understood animal movement could feed others. A skilled napper could turn carefully selected stone into reliable cutting edges. Someone who remembered a route across unfamiliar country could reduce enormous risks for everyone travelling with them. Those abilities are almost invisible in a skull. This is one of the great distortions of deep prehistory. Bones survive better than knowledge. Stone survives better than speech. Teeth survive better than relationships. So, our reconstruction naturally becomes dominated by anatomy and tools, while much of what made an ancient human life socially meaningful disappears. At Jebel Irhoud, the presence of younger individuals reminds us of this missing social world. Children had to survive long enough to grow. They had to acquire skills they were not born knowing. Human childhood is expensive in precisely this sense. Young humans remain dependent for a long time, and many of the behaviours required for successful adult life must be learned. A prepared core stone technology is not something an infant understands automatically. Neither is recognizing a useful raw material source. Neither is knowing when an animal is dangerous, where water can be found, or which plants should be avoided. Knowledge has to move between people. Without writing, that movement depends on living memory. Someone demonstrates, someone watches, someone tries badly, someone becomes better, and eventually the learner may become the person another child watches. This is culture in one of its most basic forms. We do not need beads, paintings, or monumental graves before we can speak about cultural transmission. A learned way of shaping stone is culture. A remembered route is culture. A shared method of processing an animal is culture. The difficulty is that cultural similarities do not necessarily tell us that the people involved belong to one biological population. Ideas can travel differently from genes. Two neighboring groups can copy a useful technique without merging genetically. A person can move from one community to another and carry knowledge with them. Different populations can also discover similar solutions independently when facing similar problems. So, when Middle Stone Age technologies begin appearing across broad parts of Africa, we cannot simply draw arrows from one origin point and assume a single population carried them everywhere. The tools complicate the map just as much as the skulls do, and this is where the search for the birthplace of humanity encounters a second major trap. First, we assumed the oldest fossil should reveal the birthplace, but the oldest fossil is only the oldest one discovered so far. Then we might assume the earliest important technology reveals the birthplace. But technologies can spread without population replacement, and similar technologies can emerge through more complicated processes. Then we turn to genetics. And genetics tells us ancestral populations may have remained connected rather than branching cleanly. Every line of evidence seems to remove another simple answer. Yet something significant was clearly happening across Africa during this period. Around the broad transition, beginning roughly 300,000 years ago, Middle Stone Age technologies became increasingly visible in several regions. Human anatomy was changing. Populations were responding to unstable environments. Different lineages occupied the continent simultaneously. These processes do not need to be parts of one sudden revolution. In fact, the evidence increasingly argues against a sudden revolution. What we see instead is accumulation. Anatomical changes accumulating, technological practices changing, population connections shifting, knowledge being preserved and occasionally lost, groups separating and reconnecting. The human condition was being assembled gradually, although no one alive could have known that anything unusual was happening. For them, there was no transition into modernity. There was tomorrow morning, a tool that needed sharpening, a child that needed watching, an animal trail worth following, a water source that might still be there. And this ordinary continuity may be the strangest part of our origin. From our position 300,000 years later, we searched desperately for the moment humanity began. For the people living through it, no such moment existed. But the continent around them was changing constantly, and those changes may have provided the mechanism that allowed separated human populations to remain parts of one larger evolutionary process. To understand that, we have to stop looking at skulls for a while and look instead at something enormous enough to divide a continent, the Sahara, because the desert we know today was not always a desert, and when it changed, the human map of Africa could change with it. Today, the Sahara is so enormous that it is difficult to imagine it as anything other than a barrier. From the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the Red Sea, it stretches across a vast portion of the continent, with landscapes where permanent water can be scarce and distances between habitable places can become severe. If we place Jebel Irhoud in Morocco on a modern map, and then look toward the great fossil sites of eastern and southern Africa, the distances seem to support an obvious conclusion. These populations must have been separated. At certain times, many of them probably were. The mistake is assuming that the barriers stayed in the same places. Over the immense period in which Homo sapiens emerged, African climate changed repeatedly. Rainfall patterns shifted, lakes expanded and contracted. Rivers appeared in regions that would later become extremely dry. Grasslands moved, animal ranges followed them, and human possibilities moved with them. The Sahara has experienced repeated humid phases during the Pleistocene. These were not moments when the entire desert simply transformed overnight into one continuous green paradise. Conditions varied enormously across time and space, and we should be careful not to copy the landscape of one well-documented humid period backward into another. But the larger principle is clear. The Sahara was not a permanent wall. At times it became substantially more permeable. Where water appeared, vegetation could spread. Where vegetation spread, herbivores could expand their ranges, predators followed prey, and humans could exploit many of the same ecological corridors. Then the climate shifted again. Rainfall weakened, lakes contracted, vegetation retreated, distances between reliable water sources increased. A route that had connected populations could become difficult, perhaps eventually unusable. The gate closed. For the people experiencing these changes, there was no knowledge that the Sahara was entering a new climatic phase. The transformation would often have been far slower than a human lifetime. A person might simply notice that a place remembered from childhood had changed. Perhaps water lasted for less of the year. Perhaps animals appeared less often. Perhaps a route used by older generations became increasingly unreliable. The full climatic pattern existed across centuries and millennia, while each individual experienced only a small portion of it. This difference in scale matters. When we say that climate isolated human populations, it can sound mechanical, as though a line appeared on a map. In reality, isolation could emerge through thousands of ordinary decisions. One family does not travel as far this season. Another group remains closer to a dependable water source. A neighbouring population stops appearing as regularly. A route becomes too expensive in energy and risk. Children grow up knowing fewer people from beyond the local region than their grandparents once did. Eventually, populations that had exchanged people and genes can become increasingly separated without anyone deciding to separate. Geography does the work, and then, perhaps thousands of years later, the process can reverse. Rain returns more reliably. A chain of lakes becomes productive. Grassland expands. Animals move into new territory. Humans follow opportunities. Groups that have spent long periods apart begin interacting indirectly through neighbouring populations. They do not need to know where those distant populations ultimately came from. They only need to meet the next group. This is the physical mechanism that makes a Pan-African model of human evolution easier to understand. It does not require ancient people wandering continuously from Morocco to Ethiopia to South Africa. It requires networks. Imagine a population whose ordinary territory overlaps slightly with another population to the east. That second population has contact with another, and another lies beyond them. One individual changes groups. A partnership connects neighbouring communities. Children inherit ancestry from both. Generations later, descendants move again. Over a century, the geographical effect may be small. Over 10,000 years, it can be enormous. Over 200,000 years, ancestry can travel across a continent through people who never travelled anything close to continental distances themselves. But connectivity was not constant. That is the crucial part. If everyone mixed continuously, regional differences would be harder to maintain. If populations remained completely isolated, they could diverge much more strongly. The emerging picture of early Homo sapiens may occupy the unstable territory between those extremes, separated enough for regional differences to develop, connected enough for those differences sometimes to flow back into a wider population network. Climate could repeatedly adjust the balance, and Africa provided plenty of opportunities for fragmentation, even without the Sahara. The continent contains mountain ranges, tropical forests, deserts, high plateaus, enormous river systems, and ecological boundaries that shift as climate changes. A forest can be rich in resources and still present a barrier to a population adapted to open grassland. A river can provide water while making crossing difficult. A mountain chain can separate populations on opposite sides. A lake can concentrate life along its margins while forcing travelers around it. There is no single definition of a good human habitat. It depends on what a population knows how to exploit. This brings us back to the apparently simple business of obtaining food. At Jebel Irhoud, animal remains show that humans processed gazelles and other game. Successful exploitation of mobile animals requires more than a sharp edge. Animals move according to their own needs. They seek water. They respond to seasons. They avoid danger. They reproduce at particular times. A human group that understands those patterns gains an advantage. But if climate alters the vegetation, animal behavior changes with it. The knowledge inherited from previous generations may become less reliable. This is a recurring human problem that is almost invisible in the archaeological record. Knowledge can become obsolete. A water source that existed for generations can disappear. A hunting location can become unproductive. A familiar route can become dangerous. Humans survive not merely by remembering, but by noticing when memory is no longer enough. That capacity for behavioral flexibility may have been especially important during the unstable climatic periods associated with the emergence and expansion of Homo sapiens. Eastern African environmental records indicate substantial climatic variability during much of the period in which early Homo sapiens fossils and Middle Stone Age technologies appear. The precise relationship between environmental instability and human evolution remains debated. Climate should not be treated as a magical force that automatically creates intelligence or invents species. But unstable environments change the problems populations must solve. A specialist can thrive while conditions remain familiar. When conditions repeatedly shift, flexibility becomes valuable. Humans capable of changing where they moved, what they hunted, how they organized resources, or whom they interacted with, may have been better able to persist through environmental transitions. And persistence is not the same as comfort. Mobility has costs. Everything useful has weight. Stone carried from a good source is useful, but heavy. Meat is valuable, but heavy. Water is essential and particularly inconvenient to transport without later technologies for storage. Young children cannot simply be instructed to walk 30 kilometers at an adult pace. An injured adult may transform a manageable journey into a serious logistical problem. Moving camp means deciding what cannot come with you. This is one reason archaeology can tell us something through stone that it cannot tell us through many other materials. Stone survives. Wood usually does not. Plant fibers disappear. Hides decay. Food vanishes. A carefully selected piece of flint can remain for hundreds of thousands of years. At Jebel Irhoud, some stone raw material appears to have originated tens of kilometers from the site. That does not tell us exactly who carried it or whether it moved in one journey. Material can travel through exchange or repeated movements, but it tells us the people using the site participated in a landscape larger than the cave itself. Their world had geography. Certain places were worth remembering because they contained useful stone. Others mattered because of water. Others because animals passed through them. A cave could provide shelter, but staying close to it permanently would be useless if the resources needed for survival moved elsewhere. This creates a rhythm that settled modern life makes easy to forget. The home is not necessarily the center of the world. Resources are. If animals move, people may need to move. If water fails, people move. If a nearby population becomes a threat, or an opportunity movement may change again. We cannot reconstruct the exact social geography of Jebel Irhoud, But the broader constraints of mobile foraging make one thing clear. Human life depended on information distributed across space, and information had to be remembered without maps. A ridge has a shape, a valley points somewhere, a particular rock formation may signal a useful route. The position of the sun changes through the day. Animal tracks reveal recent movement. Clouds can indicate weather. Experienced people accumulate these relationships until a landscape that appears empty to an outsider becomes filled with information. A child has to learn that landscape gradually. This is another reason long human childhood matters. Survival knowledge can be too complex to acquire quickly. Making stone tools is one skill among many. Recognizing animals, anticipating danger, locating resources, and understanding other people require years of learning. So when populations moved into new environments, they faced more than a physical problem. They faced an informational one. An unfamiliar landscape contains fewer remembered solutions. Where is dependable water? Which animals are common? Where can suitable stone be found? What happens during the dry season? Who else uses this territory? Trial and error answers these questions, but errors can be expensive. Contact with neighboring groups could therefore provide something besides genes. It could provide information. This is where biological and cultural networks begin to overlap without becoming identical. A person entering another population carries DNA, but that person may also carry a method of working stone, knowledge of a route, familiarity with a distant water source, or a technique learned somewhere else. Ideas can move even when genes do not. Genes can move without a dramatic technological change. The two histories interact, but they are not the same. This is important because the African Middle Stone Age begins to appear across large areas during roughly the broader period surrounding the emergence of Homo sapiens. Prepared core technologies, including Levallois methods, appear in geographically separated regions. It is tempting to imagine one clever population inventing a superior technology and spreading across Africa. The evidence does not require that story. Similar technological principles can spread between populations. They can be modified locally. Some may arise through convergent solutions to similar practical problems. A stone tool, therefore, cannot serve as a passport. Finding a particular reduction strategy does not tell us the exact anatomy of the person who used it. And finding similar tools thousands of kilometers apart does not prove the toolmakers belong to one migrating population. Once again, the evidence refuses to give us a clean arrow. Instead, we get overlapping maps. One for anatomy, one for technology, one for genetics, one for climate, one for animal distributions. Each map changes through time. Sometimes they align, sometimes they do not. And somewhere inside those shifting layers lived the populations that eventually produced us. There is another consequence of climate change that is easy to overlook. It does not merely open and close migration routes. It can erase populations. A small human population does not need a spectacular catastrophe to disappear. No volcano is required. No enormous predator attack. No war. Several poor seasons can be enough to create serious demographic pressure. If food becomes unreliable, children are especially vulnerable. If several adults die, the loss is not merely numerical. A small population may lose skilled hunters, experienced toolmakers, people who remember distant water sources, or adults capable of caring for dependent children. The group becomes less resilient precisely when conditions are becoming harder. Mating networks also matter. A population that becomes too isolated and too small faces demographic problems even if enough food remains. Connections with neighboring groups can therefore be valuable in ways extending far beyond immediate resource exchange. A climatic corridor that reconnects populations may restore social and reproductive possibilities as well as physical access to land. Over evolutionary timescales, some groups disappear completely. Others may disappear as distinct populations, but leave descendants among their neighbours. Their language, if they possessed one in forms we would recognise, is gone. Their social identities are gone. Their names for places are gone. But pieces of their ancestry may continue. This is why the Pan-African model does not require every ancestral population to survive. It requires interaction. Some branches can vanish, some can merge, some can contribute more than others, and the contribution of each population can change through time. The result is not a continent evolving as one perfectly unified population. It is a continent repeatedly reorganizing human relationships. That distinction matters enormously. Pan-African can easily be misunderstood as meaning Homo sapiens appeared everywhere in Africa simultaneously. That is not what the evidence establishes. Nor does it mean every region contributed equally to every feature of living humans. The stronger idea is that the evolution of our species may have involved populations distributed across Africa whose histories were connected over long periods rather than one permanently isolated birthplace. Jebel Irhoud becomes one piece of that system. Omo becomes another, Herto another. Other fossils preserve additional fragments, and the empty regions remain possibilities rather than proof of absence. The Sahara makes the entire system dynamic. Sometimes barrier, sometimes corridor, never obligated to remain what it looks like today. There is something quietly appropriate about this. We began by searching for the birthplace of a species famous for movement. Yet the landscapes in which that species emerged were themselves moving in a slower sense. Rainfall shifted. Lakes advanced and retreated. Grasslands migrated. Animal ranges changed. Human populations followed, separated, adapted, and met again. The map would not stay still long enough to provide the neat origin point we wanted. And once those populations met, something besides genes could pass between them. A way of striking stone, a better route, a habit around fire, a method of obtaining food, perhaps other forms of knowledge that left no archaeological trace at all. That creates the next problem. If anatomy, genes, and technology can each move through Africa in different ways, then the appearance of something we call modern behavior cannot simply identify the first modern humans either. The search for our birthplace is about to lose yet another marker. If a skull cannot tell us exactly when Homo sapiens began, perhaps behavior can. This idea has an immediate appeal. Instead of arguing over the curve of a forehead or the shape of a cranial vault, we could look for something recognizably human in what ancient people actually did. A carefully planned tool, controlled fire, organized hunting, objects carried across long distances. Later still, pigments, ornaments, and other traces that seem to move closer to the symbolic world we inhabit today. Find the earliest convincing collection of these behaviors, and perhaps we have found the first truly modern humans. Unfortunately, this creates almost the same problem as anatomy. The behaviors do not arrive together. At Jebel Irhoud, the stone tools belong to the African Middle Stone Age technological world. Among them are products of prepared core techniques, including Levallois methods. The finished flakes can look deceptively simple. A person unfamiliar with stone technology might pick one up and see nothing more than a sharp piece of rock. The sophistication lies partly in what happened before that flake was removed. The napper shaped the core so that later fractures could be controlled. Previous removals created the geometry needed for the intended result. The angle of the striking platform mattered. So did the distribution of force through the stone. This required anticipation. But we should resist turning anticipation into a claim that the toolmaker thought exactly as we do. Archaeology can show the technical sequence. It cannot replay the private thoughts that accompanied it. What it does show is a learned skill that would have been easy to perform badly. A poorly placed blow can damage the core. Too much force can produce an unwanted fracture. Too little may accomplish nothing useful. Raw material varies. A technique that works on one piece of stone may require adjustment on another. Competence develops through experience, and experience had to be acquired without written instruction. Somewhere in the social world, behind every carefully prepared core, was a history of learning. A younger person could watch someone more experienced. They could attempt the sequence themselves. Mistakes could be corrected through demonstration, imitation, or whatever forms of communication were available. We cannot reconstruct the lesson, but the technological tradition could not reproduce itself unless information moved between people. That makes a stone tool two things at once. It is a physical object, and it is evidence that knowledge survived long enough to be repeated. This may sound ordinary to us because we live inside systems designed to preserve information independently of individuals. A technique can be written down, filmed, copied, and stored. At Jebel Irhoud, knowledge was far more vulnerable. If nobody remembered a particular skill, the skill could disappear. If a small population lost several experienced people, it could lose more than labour. It could lose information accumulated over years. This makes social learning part of survival. And the same applies beyond stone. Consider the animal remains at Jebel Irhoud. Gazelles were especially important among the animals people processed there. Cut marks indicate butchery, and broken long bones reveal the extraction of resources, such as marrow. None of this requires spectacular technology, but it does require practical competence. A dead animal presents a series of decisions. Which parts are worth processing? Which can be transported? How quickly must the work be done? Where should a joint be cut? How can a long bone be broken efficiently? The answers are constrained by anatomy, tools, time, and hunger. Fresh meat also changes the immediate environment. In warm conditions, it does not remain fresh indefinitely. A carcass can attract scavengers. Processing takes time. Carrying large portions costs energy. The people performing this work were therefore making practical decisions under conditions that rarely fossilize. We see the cut mark. We do not see the urgency. We see the broken bone. We do not see how far it was carried. This distinction matters because ancient human behavior is often reconstructed from the durable remains of activities whose most important parts disappeared. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Wood usually does not. Plant material often disappears. Hides decay. Fibers vanish. The archaeological record is therefore biased toward behaviors that happen to produce durable debris. An ancient population could possess an elaborate body of ecological knowledge and leave almost no direct physical evidence of it. They could understand seasonal animal movements. They could recognize useful plants. They could know routes between water sources. They could have social rules governing who travelled with whom. Most of that would disappear. So when we ask whether a population was behaviourally modern, we are judging a vanished social world from the small fraction of its activities capable of surviving hundreds of thousands of years. Fire provides a perfect example. At Jebel Irhoud, heated flints and combustion evidence show that fire was part of the human occupation of the site. To us, fire can easily become visual decoration in prehistoric scenes. A warm orange glow placed in the centre of a cave. For the people using it, fire was work. Fuel had to come from somewhere. Someone had to gather combustible material. A fire that died had to be rebuilt or relit. Smoke could irritate eyes and lungs, especially in sheltered spaces with poor airflow. Sparks could burn. Fuel could become scarce. Yet fire transformed the usable day. After sunset, without artificial illumination, darkness becomes a physical boundary. A flame creates a small zone where hands can continue working and faces remain visible. Beyond it, the landscape does not cease to exist. It merely becomes harder for human eyes to read. At Jebel Irhoud, the surrounding fauna included large carnivores such as hyenas and leopards. That does not mean predators gathered outside the site every night, and there is no evidence allowing us to reconstruct such a scene. But humans occupied an ecosystem in which other large animals competed for space and food. Darkness changed the balance of information. A sound outside the visible area could be harmless, or not. Fire reduced some uncertainties while creating its own demands. And, by extraordinary accident, those ancient fires eventually helped researchers date the site. A flint heated sufficiently hundreds of thousands of years ago had its thermoluminescence signal reset. Once buried, energy began accumulating again inside the mineral structure through exposure to natural background radiation. The people around the fire had no idea they were doing anything permanent. From their perspective, the stone was hot. From ours, it became a clock. There is something tempting about treating this mastery of fire as another marker of modern humanity. But fire is far older than Homo sapiens. Other hominins used it. The same problem appears with sophisticated stone technologies. Prepared core methods are impressive, but planning is not exclusive to our species. Hunting is not exclusive to Homo sapiens. Care for dependent young certainly is not unique to the populations represented at Jebel Irhoud. One by one, the behaviours we might use to draw a clean boundary begin to fail. Later, in African prehistory, additional evidence appears for activities that many researchers have associated more closely with symbolic behaviour: pigments, ornaments, engraved objects, and other forms of material culture whose practical function cannot always explain their form. But even these do not appear everywhere at once. A symbolic object can appear at one site and be absent at another. A practice can persist for a time and disappear. Innovation does not guarantee permanent adoption. This is easy to forget because we tend to view technology from the successful end of the process. Something useful is invented. It spreads. Everyone keeps it. History rarely behaves so politely. Small populations can lose technologies. Materials can become unavailable. A technique useful in one environment may have little value in another. Knowledge can fail to pass between generations. And innovation can simply be forgotten. So behavioral evolution can be irregular in the same way anatomical evolution is. Traits appear in different combinations. Some spread, some vanish, some return later in altered forms. And the concept of a single behavioral revolution becomes increasingly difficult to sustain across the full depth and geographical scale of African prehistory. This does not make early humans less interesting. It makes their world more human. They inherited traditions. They modified some. They lost others. They solved problems using whatever knowledge and materials were available locally. And different populations did not necessarily solve the same problem in the same way. This matters enormously for the Pan-African picture. If a technological practice appears in Morocco and another broadly related practice appears in Eastern Africa, we cannot automatically conclude that one population carried it directly between those places. Ideas can spread through intermediate groups. Similar solutions can develop independently, and populations can exchange techniques without exchanging enough genes to become biologically uniform. Culture can cross boundaries that anatomy preserves. The reverse is possible too. People can interbreed without one group immediately adopting every behavior of the other. This means our different maps are now separating even further. The fossil map tells us where certain bodies survived. The genetic map reconstructs relationships among ancestral populations. The archaeological map shows surviving fragments of behavior. The climate map tells us when landscapes may have become easier or harder to cross. None of them is a perfect substitute for another. Yet, when they are placed together, a broad pattern emerges. By roughly 300,000 years ago, humans with important Homo sapiens characteristics were present in northwestern Africa. By more than 233,000 years ago, a strongly derived Homo sapiens anatomy was present in eastern Africa at Omo. Other African fossils preserve different combinations of features. Middle Stone Age technologies were appearing across broad regions, and very different human lineages, including Homo naledi, still existed on the continent during part of this same enormous period. Nothing about that picture resembles one finished population suddenly stepping onto an empty stage. The stage was already crowded. The actors were changing, and some of them may have been exchanging genes, technologies, or both. There is another reason we should be cautious about searching for a moment of behavioral modernity. Many of the abilities that matter most to human survival leave no recognizable artifact. Cooperation is one. A group attempting to exploit mobile game benefits from coordination, but archaeology rarely preserves the sequence of gestures, signals, or decisions that made cooperation possible. Tolerance is another. Human children remain dependent for years. Keeping them alive requires repeated investment by adults. An injured person can create additional demands on a mobile group. Older individuals may carry knowledge even when their physical productivity changes. How early human populations balance these costs is almost invisible archaeologically. Yet social interdependence is central to human life. Communication is perhaps the greatest missing piece. We do not know what languages, if any in the fully modern sense, were spoken by the people at Jebel Irhoud. The anatomy and archaeology cannot give us their vocabulary or grammar. We should not put invented words in their mouths. But coordinated human life requires information to move somehow. A person can point, demonstrate, gesture, vocalize, watch another person's attention. Whatever the precise communication system, practical knowledge had to pass through social interaction. This means that some of the most important evolutionary developments may leave almost no direct archaeological signature. A skull can change shape and fossilize. A sentence disappears the moment it is spoken. A stone tool can survive 300,000 years. A warning given to a child lasts a few seconds. Yet the warning may save the child, allowing that child to grow, reproduce, and carry knowledge forward. The invisible behavior can matter more than the durable object. This is one reason paleoanthropology becomes increasingly humbling the closer we look. We possess astonishing evidence, but astonishing evidence is not complete evidence. The surviving record encourages us to focus on the things that endure, while evolution operated through entire lives. Hunger mattered, fatigue mattered, learning mattered, social relationships mattered, successful reproduction mattered, periods of isolation mattered, encounters with other populations mattered. Most left no object we can place in a museum case, and yet these invisible processes may be exactly what transformed a collection of African populations into the ancestry of everyone alive today. By now, our original question has changed almost completely. We began by asking where Homo sapiens was born. Jebel Irhoud made the date and location uncertain. Omo showed that anatomical modernity did not progress in a simple line. Herto and other fossils revealed continuing variation. Homo naledi showed that several kinds of human could share the same continent in overlapping periods. Genetics replaced a single ancestral population with the possibility of prolonged structure and gene flow. Climate turned barriers into corridors and corridors back into barriers. And behavior refuses to provide a clean starting line either. There is still one way to rescue the old idea. Perhaps all these scattered populations were interesting side branches, while somewhere still undiscovered there really was one small population from which the essential ancestry of living Homo sapiens emerged. Scientists have considered versions of that possibility, but when genetic models, fossils, archaeology, and African geography are taken together, maintaining a simple, isolated cradle becomes increasingly difficult. The alternative is more complicated, but it may also be closer to reality. Our species may not have been born like a city founded on a particular date. It may have been assembled. And if that is true, the final question is no longer where the first Homo sapiens lived. It is how many different ancient populations had to meet before something recognizably like us could exist. By this point, the evidence has left us with several maps that refuse to collapse into one. There is Jebel Irhoud in northwestern Africa, with human remains dating to roughly 300,000 years ago, and faces that already possess important Homo sapiens characteristics. There is Omo in eastern Africa, younger but in some anatomical respects more recognizably modern. There is Herto, later still, preserving another robust form of early Homo sapiens. There are more ambiguous fossils, such as Florisbad, whose anatomy remains important even while aspects of its chronology deserve caution. There are other human lineages, including Homo naledi, occupying Africa during overlapping stretches of time. Then there are the stone tools, the changing climates, the corridors that open and close, and the genetic evidence suggesting that the ancestry of living humans may reach through several connected African populations rather than one perfectly isolated ancestral group. Placed separately, each piece is incomplete. Placed together, they suggest a different kind of origin. This is where the term Pan-African becomes useful, but it is also where it can easily be misunderstood. A Pan-African model does not mean that Homo sapiens appeared everywhere across Africa at exactly the same time. It does not mean every ancient African population was part of our direct ancestry. It does not mean every region contributed equally. And it certainly does not mean that someone at Jebel Irhoud could walk south, meet every other human population on the continent, and participate in one enormous interconnected community. The distances were real. The barriers were real. Isolation was real. What may not have been permanent was the isolation. Over hundreds of thousands of years, populations could separate, develop regional characteristics, and later exchange genes with neighboring groups. Those neighbors could, in turn, connect with populations farther away. The network did not need to exist everywhere at once. It only needed to remain connected often enough over sufficiently long periods for ancestry to move through it. This gives us a way to understand something that otherwise seems contradictory. Early African fossils can look different from one another without requiring each one to belong to a completely separate evolutionary experiment. Populations can differ while remaining connected. We see this principle among living organisms as well. Gene flow does not instantly erase regional variation. Its effects depend on population size, geography, frequency of contact, and the amount of movement between groups. Early African populations may have occupied this middle condition for very long periods. Different, but not necessarily disconnected forever. If so, then the features we associate with Homo sapiens could have accumulated across that network. The word assembled is useful here as long as we do not take it too literally. There was no plan. No population contributed a chin because another had already supplied the forehead. Evolution has no committee. But traits can become common in one population, spread through gene flow, encounter other combinations elsewhere, and be reshuffled across generations. Over enough time, the overall population system changes. Eventually, combinations that were once rare or geographically restricted become widespread. The characteristic Homo sapiens anatomy emerges from the process. This also helps explain why Jebel Irhoud should not simply be crowned the new birthplace of humanity. That would repeat the old mistake with a different dot on the map. The Moroccan fossils are extraordinarily important because of their age and anatomy. They demonstrate that early members of the Homo sapiens lineage, broadly understood, were present in northwestern Africa far earlier than the older simple models anticipated. They do not demonstrate that all later Homo sapiens descended from one Moroccan population. Oldest known is not the same as first, and first known is not the same as universal ancestor. If an older fossil is discovered elsewhere in Africa tomorrow, Jebel Irhoud will not suddenly become irrelevant. Its importance lies in what it already proves about the geographical and anatomical complexity of our emergence. This distinction is worth holding on to because human beings are remarkably attracted to records. Oldest, first, earliest. The categories are useful for headlines, but evolution is not competing for them. Suppose a fossil 340,000 years old is found in another region and classified securely within the early Homo sapiens lineage. The headline would change. The evolutionary process would not. That population was already there, whether we discovered it or not. Our map changes when evidence changes. The past does not, and there are good reasons to suspect that the map remains severely incomplete. Africa is vast. Some environments preserve bone poorly. Some regions have received far more paleoanthropological attention than others. Some ancient surfaces have eroded away. Others are buried deeply. Some former coastlines lie underwater. The populations we know are therefore a sample selected by geology, preservation, discovery, and research. There is no reason to assume the sample contains every major population involved in our ancestry. In fact, genetic evidence gives us reasons to suspect histories that fossils have not yet revealed. Models involving deep population structure and debates over possible contributions from unsampled archaic populations remind us that ancestry can leave a signal even when the people themselves leave no identified skeleton. A population can become a ghost in two different ways. It can disappear from the landscape, and it can disappear from the fossil record. Its descendants may still carry pieces of it. This creates an unusual reversal. Normally, we think of fossils as evidence of people who no longer exist, but some of the most important ancient populations may survive more clearly inside living people than in the ground, and even there, their identity is blurred. Genes do not preserve tribal names. They do not preserve stories. They do not tell us what a population called itself, whether it recognized neighboring groups as similar, or what social rules governed encounters between them. Genetics can reveal ancestry without recovering identity. The distinction between those two things becomes enormous at this depth of time. A population that contributed to us biologically was not necessarily culturally similar to another ancestral population. Two groups could exchange genes while maintaining different traditions. Conversely, a useful technology could spread between groups with limited genetic exchange. So, even if the Pan-African model is broadly correct, we should not imagine one slowly homogenizing African culture. There may have been many worlds, different landscapes, different raw materials, different hunting opportunities, different learned traditions, different social networks, and almost certainly countless differences that archaeology can no longer see. The human evolutionary network was biological. The human experience inside it was local. Someone living near Jebel Irhoud did not experience Pan-African evolution. They experienced the next journey, the next dry period, the next animal to process, the next piece of stone, the next child who needed to learn what adults already knew. This gap between evolutionary scale and human scale is easy to lose when talking about 300,000 years. At the evolutionary scale, populations separate and reconnect. At the human scale, one person leaves one group and joins another. At the evolutionary scale, genes flow between regions. At the human scale, people have children. At the evolutionary scale, technology disperses. At the human scale, Someone watches another person perform a useful action and remembers it. At the evolutionary scale, climate restructures habitat. At the human scale, the water is farther away than it used to be. Nothing about the process needs to feel historically important while it is happening. And this may be the best way to understand why there was probably no moment anyone could have recognized as the birth of our species. Even if we could stand invisibly at Jebel Irhoud 300,000 years ago, we would not see evolution happening in the way a city can be seen burning or an army can be seen arriving. We would see people living, a person carrying stone, someone processing an animal, children learning, fire being maintained, people moving through familiar terrain, perhaps strangers occasionally appearing from somewhere beyond that familiar territory. Generation replaces generation. The dramatic transformation exists only when those generations are compressed into geological time. This is why the familiar illustration of human evolution can be so misleading. A sequence of figures walking from an ape-like ancestor toward a modern human suggests that evolution is a procession. Each figure replaces the previous one. Each becomes more advanced. The destination is obvious. But the African Middle Pleistocene looks nothing like a procession. It looks like overlapping populations. Some survive. Some vanish. Some meet. Some remain separated. Some contribute ancestry to later humans. Others may contribute little or none, and the outcome was not predetermined. Had climate shifted differently, had particular populations disappeared, or had connections between regions remained closed for longer, the ancestry of living humans might not be the same. We are not the inevitable final form toward which all those populations were moving. We are what survived from a particular history of populations. That history also makes the phrase archaic human feel slightly different. It is useful scientifically, but it can encourage us to imagine a gulf between them and ourselves. At Jebel Irhoud, the gulf becomes uncomfortable. The face narrows it. The elongated brain case widens it again. The tools narrow it. The enormous chronological distance widens it. Then the evidence of children, food processing, and learned behavior brings them closer once more. They are neither modern people misplaced in deep time, nor crude prototypes waiting to become us. They belong to their own world. And yet that world sits close to the beginning of ours. This is one reason the shape of the Jebel Irhoud brain case is so informative. The fossils suggest that aspects of the characteristic Homo sapiens face had emerged before the fully globular cranial shape seen in living humans. The implication is gradual reorganization rather than simultaneous transformation. Later, Homo sapiens fossils show the more derived cranial condition increasingly clearly. Again, the pieces arrive at different times. The same pattern may apply more broadly to behavior. There is no need for one cognitive revolution to switch on everything recognizable about modern humans. Different abilities, traditions, and social practices can accumulate gradually, spread unevenly, and combine over time. The emergence of our species then becomes less like crossing a doorway and more like entering a region with no sharp boundary. Far enough back, the population is clearly different from living Homo sapiens. Far enough forward, the continuity with us becomes unmistakable. In between lies the territory occupied by fossils like Jebel Irhoud. And any line we draw through that territory is partly a scientific decision about how to classify continuous evolutionary change. This does not make the term Homo sapiens meaningless. It makes its beginning difficult to reduce to a birthday. Species can be real without having a single identifiable first member. A population changes across generations. No child needs to belong to a completely different species from its parents. Yet given enough time, the descendants can become distinguishable from their distant ancestors. The transformation happens through continuity. This is the paradox at the center of the search for the first human. If evolution works gradually, The closer we get to the beginning of our species, the harder the boundary should become to see. We went looking for clarity in the oldest fossils. Instead, ambiguity may be exactly what evolution predicts. And that brings us back to the continent itself. The older single origin picture offered something emotionally satisfying. Somewhere there was a homeland, a small region where people sufficiently like us first appeared. From there, their descendants eventually carried humanity outward. The newer picture does not eliminate Africa as the homeland of Homo sapiens. It makes Africa itself more important. The origin is still African. But the relevant scale may be continental rather than local. Northern Africa can matter. Eastern Africa can matter. Southern populations can matter. Regions with poor fossil preservation may matter. Connections between them can matter as much as any individual location. The cradle becomes a network, and even that metaphor has limitations, because a cradle holds one infant in one place. Our ancestry may have spent hundreds of thousands of years refusing to stay still. This does not mean the scientific debate is finished. Far from it. Researchers continue to disagree about the classification of particular fossils, the degree of ancient population structure, the importance of specific regions, and how best to interpret genetic signals that can be produced by different demographic histories. A Pan-African model is not one single solved diagram accepted in every detail. It is a broad family of explanations, responding to a growing problem with simpler alternatives. That uncertainty should remain in the story. Science does not become weaker when it admits what the evidence cannot yet distinguish. The uncertainty is part of the evidence. We can be confident that Jebel Irhoud profoundly extended the known history of early Homo sapiens-like anatomy. We can be confident that early African humans were morphologically diverse. We can be confident that African environments repeatedly changed and altered opportunities for population movement. Genomic evidence strongly supports complex ancestral population structure and long-term gene flow, rather than an excessively simple, isolated origin model. But we cannot identify every population that contributed to living humans. We cannot assign each anatomical feature to one region. We cannot draw every migration route. And we cannot point to one individual and say, with scientific seriousness, here is the first person. That person may never have existed in the sense the question assumes. There were parents. There were children. There were populations. There was change. Eventually, there was us, which leaves us with one final journey, back to Morocco, back to a limestone hill disturbed by miners who had no idea what they were opening. Because after all the genetics, skull measurements, climate records, and arguments about species, the most important thing about Jebel Irhoud may be surprisingly simple. The fossils did not give humanity a new birthplace. They helped show us why we may never find one. So we return, at last, to Jebel Irhoud, back to a limestone hill in Morocco, where miners were looking for barite and encountered something considerably older. When the first human skull appeared there, around 1960, nobody could yet know what the site would eventually do to our understanding of ourselves. The dating methods that would transform its importance had not been applied. Other crucial fossils had not yet been discovered or redated. Modern genomic studies capable of reconstructing complicated ancient population histories were decades away. There was simply a skull emerging from disturbed ground. Today, we can place that skull inside a much larger picture. Around 315,000 years ago, within the uncertainty of the dating, humans represented at Jebel Irhoud were living in northwestern Africa. They made Middle Stone Age tools. They used fire. They processed animals, particularly gazelles. Adults and younger individuals are represented among the remains. And when we look at their faces, much of what we associate with Homo sapiens is already there. Move around the skull, however, and the familiarity weakens. The brain case remains more elongated than ours. That contrast may be one of the most valuable things Jebel Irhoud has given us. It catches evolution unfinished only from our perspective. The people themselves were not unfinished. They were not waiting for rounder skulls, later technologies, agriculture, cities, or us. They were simply alive. Whatever their social relationships were, whatever forms of communication they used, whatever knowledge they possessed that left no archaeological trace, their lives took place entirely in their own present. They woke without knowing they belonged to deep prehistory. They encountered weather without knowing it would become climate data. They heated stone without knowing the heat would eventually help date their occupation. They discarded bones without knowing cut marks would survive long after every memory of the meal had vanished. Nothing about their ordinary lives needed to feel like the beginning of anything. That is largely a question we brought with us. We wanted to know where humanity began. For a time, the answer seemed as though it might be found in Eastern Africa at around 200,000 years ago. Then the timeline stretched. Omo proved older than the once familiar estimate, lying beneath volcanic material now dated to roughly 233,000 years ago. Jebel Irhoud pushed recognizable Homo sapiens characteristics deeper still toward 300,000 years and into another corner of the continent. Other fossils complicated the anatomy. Genetics complicated the populations. Climate complicated the geography. And eventually the original question began to look suspiciously simple. There is still a meaningful answer to where Homo sapiens originated. Africa. The evidence for the deep African origin of our species is overwhelming. What has become harder to defend is the idea that this necessarily means one small, isolated place inside Africa, where a finished Homo sapiens population appeared and from which everyone else descended. The alternative is less tidy. Populations lived apart, they changed. Some disappeared, others expanded. At times, environmental barriers separated them. At other times, changing conditions allowed renewed contact. Genes passed between populations. Knowledge may have passed through different networks. Anatomical characteristics accumulated at different rates. Over immense spans of time, the ancestry that eventually produced living humans took shape. No one had to understand the process. No one had to travel across the entire continent, and there did not need to be one morning when the first true human opened their eyes. That last point may be the hardest to accept, because beginnings are useful. We organize lives around them: birthdays, founding dates, first settlements, first rulers, first inventions. A beginning gives a story somewhere to stand. Evolution offers no such courtesy. If we could somehow return to Africa 300,000 years ago and walk from population to population, perhaps the boundaries we now argue about would become even less comfortable. Here might be people whose faces strike us as surprisingly familiar. Elsewhere, people whose skulls preserve another combination of traits. Farther away, a different human lineage entirely. And between them, enormous spaces containing populations whose fossils we may never recover. There would be no labels, no Homo sapiens written beneath one group, no Homo naledi beneath another, only living populations, each carrying an evolutionary history they could not see. If we travelled forward generation by generation, the change would be almost impossible to notice. Children resemble parents. Their children resemble them. A slightly different trait becomes more common. Another disappears. A population becomes isolated. Much later, descendants meet people whose ancestors followed another path. They have children. Ancestries combine. The process continues. Only after compressing tens of thousands of generations do the differences become obvious enough for us to name. This is why the search for the first Homo sapiens may contain a category error. There may have been no single individual who could meaningfully carry that title. There were populations undergoing change. Somewhere along that continuous process, the anatomy and ancestry we recognize as Homo sapiens became established. Where we choose to place the taxonomic boundary can be scientifically useful, but the boundary does not have to correspond to a single biological birthday. Jebel Irhoud sits close to that uncomfortable territory, and this is precisely why the fossils are more interesting than a simple claim that they are the oldest humans. Calling them the oldest known Homo sapiens and stopping there turns a complicated discovery into a record. Records are easily replaced. Another excavation could uncover older remains next year. The deeper implication would survive. By the time represented at Jebel Irhoud, important pieces of the Homo sapiens anatomical pattern already existed, far from the Eastern African locations that had dominated older origin narratives. Whatever was happening was geographically broad, and the fossil record we possess is almost certainly only a fraction of it. Somewhere beneath African sediments, there may be skulls belonging to populations we have never encountered. In other regions, the evidence may already have been destroyed. In tropical environments, ancient DNA has degraded beyond recovery. Along former coastlines, archaeological landscapes may now lie beneath the sea. Entire populations may have existed without leaving a trace we will ever recognize. Their absence from our map does not mean they were absent from our history. Perhaps some contributed little to living human ancestry. Perhaps others contributed substantially. Perhaps future fossils will rearrange the picture again. That possibility is not a weakness in the science. It is what makes deep prehistory different from recorded history. We are reconstructing an enormous human process from a very small surviving sample. Every conclusion has to respect that imbalance. And so the map of human origins looks different now. Instead of one dot, there are several. Instead of one arrow, there are changing connections. Instead of one ancestral population becoming steadily more modern, there are populations carrying different combinations of traits. Instead of a ladder, there is something closer to a network. And behind that network lies the changing African landscape itself. Wet periods opening roots, dry periods closing them, lakes expanding and disappearing, grasslands moving, animals following resources, humans following animals, water, stone, opportunity, and one another. Across a few years, these movements would have seemed ordinary. Across 300,000 years, they helped create us. There is a final irony in the story of Jebel Irhoud. The site became famous because we are obsessed with beginnings. We wanted the oldest Homo sapiens. We wanted a date. We wanted a location. The fossils gave us all three, at least provisionally. Morocco, roughly 315,000 years. Early Homo sapiens. And then, almost immediately, they made those answers less satisfying, because the real importance of the discovery was not that it moved the pin marking humanity's birthplace from one part of Africa to another. It suggested that perhaps we should stop looking for the pin. The face from Jebel Irhoud belongs to a population separated from us by an almost incomprehensible amount of time, more than 3,000 centuries, long before farming, long before permanent cities, long before writing, long before any surviving name for any individual. And yet when that face is reconstructed, the distance briefly contracts. There is enough familiarity to make the person difficult to dismiss as something completely other. Then we see the shape of the skull and the distance opens again. That tension is where the story should remain. They were not us, but they belonged to the process that produced us. And somewhere else in Africa, other populations were living through their own parts of that process. No one population needed to know the others existed. No one generation needed to recognize that anything was changing. The species could emerge through millions of ordinary lives. People searching for food, carrying children, learning landscapes, shaping stone, maintaining fire, moving when conditions demanded it, meeting strangers occasionally, having children, growing old when fortune allowed, and disappearing without knowing that hundreds of thousands of years later, another group of humans would search the ground for evidence that they had ever existed. So if someone asks where humanity was born, there is still a simple answer: in Africa. But if they ask for the exact place, the exact population, or the exact moment when people became us, the most accurate answer may be quieter. We do not know, and it is possible that no single place ever held that distinction. Perhaps humanity did not begin at one point on the map. Perhaps, slowly, through isolation and reunion, through changing landscapes and changing bodies, through populations whose names are lost and others whose bones have not yet been found, it emerged across a continent, and somewhere beneath the ground there may still be another face waiting to change the map again. For tonight, though, we can leave the limestone hill in Morocco where we found it. Quiet again. The miners are gone. The fires have been cold for hundreds of thousands of years. The people who once sat near them are beyond memory. But a few pieces remained: a skull, a jaw, a tooth, stone touched by fire. Just enough for us to understand that the beginning of our species may have been far larger, slower, and more complicated than any single birthplace could contain.